On the 18th of December, 1892, in an abandoned warehouse near Pine Ridge Pass, Wyoming Territory, Clara Hensley, a 33-year-old widow, held her 6-year-old son in her arms, while Lucky the dog lay close by, all three taking temporary shelter from the blizzard, ravaging the mountains with winds of 55-60 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind pounded the curved steel dome of the warehouse, producing deep, muffled vibrations. But what kept Clara's eyes fixed was how the snow slid off the curved surface, as if forced away by its very shape. It didn't pile up into heavy masses, didn't build pressure to collapse anything, just continuously streamed down in flows. She reached out to feel the air inside. Still cold, but not the kind of cold that sucked the breath out, which had killed her husband the previous winter, when the north wind tore their wooden cabin apart in less than 20 seconds. That memory choked her, the sound of beams snapping, the wind sucking hard as if to swallow the whole house, her husband's desperate cry as the snow crashed down. A year had passed, yet Clara's hands still trembled whenever she remembered it. But tonight, under the curved steel roof nearly 18 feet high and 30 feet wide, she saw something she had never noticed before. Wind couldn't break a curved surface. Snow couldn't cling. Compressive force was neutralized the moment it dispersed to both sides. Lucky lifted his head to look at her, ears twitching slightly as if sensing his owner's breathing had changed. She tightened her arms around her son, then stared at the steel beams that had stood firm for over 20 years since the old railroad line was active. Why is a goods warehouse better protected than a cabin meant for people? The question stabbed her chest, but at the same time it sparked a sharp thought like a needle piercing the stormy night. Clara looked at the steel dome again, distinctly feeling the small temperature difference between inside and outside, just 6 degrees Fahrenheit, but enough to make the difference between life and death. And right then, she whispered, voice trembling but firm, if this steel shell can protect goods, it can also save a home. The thought came as fast as wind whipping through the mountain gap, but clung to her more tightly than any fear. Amid the roaring storm outside, Clara understood that she had just found the way to never lose anyone again. On the 5th of October, 1892, Clara Hensley arrived in Red Valley, Montana Territory, with exactly $12 tucked in her coat pocket, an old cloth bag holding all that remained of her late husband's tools, and her 6-year-old son clinging to her hand after 3 days on the road. The town lay under early season wind, dirt roads covered in a thin layer of white dust signaling that cold gusts from the Bitterroot Range would soon sweep down. Clara stopped in front of Elias Rowe's general store, the man known for being so practical it was irritating, always viewing everything through a profit and loss lens. Elias squinted at her from head to toe, then at the child and Lucky standing close by. What are you here for? Work? Or just a place to hole up for the winter? Clara answered simply, I'm here to build a home. Sheriff Lorne Briggs passed by, overheard, and burst out laughing as if he'd heard a joke. A home? In this area? A woman? North Bluff can't even hold strong men, let alone. Clara didn't reply, only asked to see the land map. Elias sighed, pulled out an old sheet and pointed to the right corner. If you're really buying, this is the cheapest lot. North Bluff. 3 cabins collapsed in 12 years. The last person living there left last winter. How much? $11. Clara placed the money on the counter. The way she did it quick, decisive, made Elias pause slightly, while Sheriff Briggs let out an uncontrollable laugh. As if that means you'll make it through the winter. News of the young widow buying North Bluff spread through town faster than wind through the valley. When people asked what she planned to do with that death trap land, Clara said plainly, I'll build a cabin under a steel dome 40-45 feet high. The statement set all of Red Valley ablaze with laughter. In the saloon, people slammed tables laughing. She's planning to live in a steel donkey shed. In the churchyard, women whispered, a widow might be good at sewing, but building a house. At the forge, Johann Keller quietly set his hammer down, looking out as if what he'd heard wasn't funny at all. Martha Caldwell was the only one who didn't laugh. When she saw Clara pass by, Martha lightly touched her shoulder. If you believe in it, don't listen to them. But most of the town treated Clara's idea as a bizarre amusement, a topic for mockery every evening. Still, one person began paying real attention. Johann Keller, the German-born blacksmith who understood steel structures better than anyone in the area. Keller went to the general store and asked Clara, "How high is the steel dome? How curved? What will you reinforce it with?" Clara answered each question slowly but surely. "I want it curved enough for snow to slide off, high enough so wind doesn't create eddies inside. Foundations buried 3 feet deep, braced like mining tunnels." Keller was silent for a moment, then said something that made the whole town look at him strangely. "A properly curved structure can bear 3 times the snow load of a pitched roof. Not everyone knows that." That statement planted a seed of doubt in the community. What if the widow wasn't completely crazy? But that doubt was still very thin compared to the wave of ridicule when Clara began her first task, gathering steel from an abandoned mine 12 miles away. She had no wagon, only a broken axle cart with one wheel tilted, reinforced with scrap wood she picked up along the way. The steel sheets, over 10 feet long, were so heavy that each lift required her to put all her strength into her shoulders, the edges cutting into her hands until they bled. Lucky circled around guarding because the scent of wolves grew stronger each time. Twice she had to quickly start a fire to drive off approaching wolf packs, standing in the dark, muddy forest with only firelight and the howling wind in her ears. In the mountain road mud, the wheels sank on slopes, forcing her to pry them up with an old crowbar. Strong gusts pushed the cart sideways, nearly toppling Clara down the forested slope. Often she had to tie the steel with rope and drag it along the ground. When she returned to Red Valley each evening, hands shaking from exhaustion, clothes caked in mud, Lucky dusted with snow, townspeople gathered to watch like it was a strange show after work hours. They stood on the hill with arms folded, pointing. "Look, the widow hauling steel. She thinks she's a blacksmith? Won't make it to December." But they still watched, because something in the way Clara worked kept their eyes glued. 1 sheet of steel per day, then another, then another. No complaints, no arguments, no asking for help. Just steady steps up the slope, followed by loyal Lucky. When she attached the first steel sheet to the North Bluff foundation, the sound of Clara's hammer echoed down to town like a challenge. Villagers gathered in small groups. Sheriff Briggs folded his arms. "You really planning to build something taller than this horse barn?" Elias Rowe scratched his chin. "If the wind hits 50 miles per hour like last year, this thing will probably fly across the valley." But Keller stepped closer, touched the steel sheet, and gave a small nod. "You chose the right curve." That remark made a few frown. Why would a blacksmith take it so seriously? Clara continued with the second sheet, the third. She drove each bolt with decisive hammer strikes, sweat and snow mixing on her forehead. When the fourth sheet rose to form a clear part of the dome frame, the town's laughter began to fade. People walked slower when coming to watch, looked more carefully. A woman raising a dome 45 feet high was unimaginable, but it was happening right before their eyes. Martha Caldwell whispered to the person next to her, "Maybe she knows what she's doing." The other replied, "Or maybe she's just stubborn?" Martha smiled faintly. "Both, probably." When Clara returned to the forge to ask Keller about further reinforcement, he said something the people of Red Valley would remember for years. Crazy ideas aren't the worst kind. The worst are the ideas everyone believes, but are wrong. From that day, the mocking laughter continued, but behind it emerged something else, curiosity and a touch of fear. If that widow really built a steel dome that stood firm in the storm, it would mean they'd been living wrong all these years. By the end of the second week, when Clara dragged the 17th sheet to the base of the hill, the ones who'd laughed the loudest were now the first to come watch. And when they saw her bloodied hands still gripping the steel edge tightly, they fell silent. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. The woman they called crazy was perhaps the only one in town truly preparing for the coming winter. 6 weeks after the first steel sheet haul to North Bluff, on the morning of the 17th of November, 1892, as the sun just peeked over the Bitterroot Range, Clara Hensley tightened the final bolt on the steel dome and stepped back a few paces to view the entire structure, the thing Red Valley had both mocked and couldn't look away from for over a month and a half. The steel dome rose like a giant beast, crouching on the hillside. 38 feet wide, 52 feet long, curved in a 3/4 circle, foundations buried 3 feet deep in the hard fall soil. Reinforced with bracing, Keller had guided in the style of German mine tunnels, where they were used to bearing heavier rock and snow loads than anywhere in Montana. When she lightly tapped each steel sheet with the hammer head to check tension, the sound rang out deep, even, and solid, like a metallic heartbeat beating beneath the first seasonal snow. Wind blew hard at 20-25 miles per hour from the north, flattening grass along the hill, but when it hit the dome, the wind split into two streams sliding along the curve, creating an odd, breathless, whistling sound. That was the first moment in a year Clara stood before winter wind without fear. She tilted her face up to the dome's peak nearly 45 feet high, where morning light struck the steel in silver streaks, and realized this space, invisible yet real, was what her cabin last year had lacked. An invisible wall that kept death from coming too fast. Her husband hadn't had that chance. Thinking of it, Clara's hands paused for a few seconds. Then she took a deep breath and moved to the next part, building the wooden cabin inside. The small 16 times 20 feet cabin was built with thick pine logs she bought from the valley sawmill, carefully selected for grain to avoid cracking when temperatures dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The cabin roof was light, only slightly sloped, because all snow load was now borne by the steel dome. To outsiders, her cabin looked too small compared to the giant dome outside. But to Clara, it was the heart of this fortress, a warm core nestled in steel armor. She built a chimney through a small gap in the dome. Keller personally came to check and install a wind guard to prevent the backdraft common at North Bluff, where every gust could pull smoke back down like devils dragging it. At the cabin front, Clara built a small porch, a porch entirely within the steel dome, where wind couldn't reach, where her son could sit and play, and Lucky could curl up without skin-cutting cold. That was something no cabin in the region had, a storm-proof porch right in the middle of winter. But the structure truly took shape when Clara began building 2 woodpile walls. She felled trees on the west hillside where snow hadn't yet covered everything, split each log, and stacked them 8 feet high, running the full length of the cabin between cabin and steel dome. Since the dome sheltered all rain and snow, the wood stayed completely dry, never freezing, never absorbing moisture, meaning it burned easily, gave off lots of heat, and most importantly, could be stored long-term. She calculated the dense wood walls would last 2 years if used sparingly, 1 year if winter was too harsh. Physically, the 2 wood walls also created an extra insulation layer, trapping cabin heat, blocking drafts, turning the space between cabin and dome into a dry air buffer that Clara once accidentally called a heat oasis. To verify, she decided to recheck temperatures on the evening of November 22. Outside minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit, wind 25 miles per hour. Under the dome minus 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin, even though she'd extinguished the stove an hour earlier, the temperature held at 14 degrees Fahrenheit. To someone who'd never experienced a Montana winter, those numbers meant nothing. But to Clara, they marked the line between life and death. Last year's cabin, even with constant fire, only held minus 5 degrees Fahrenheit on stormy nights before the roof collapsed. Now, even without fire, the cabin maintained a positive number. She looked at the thermometer readings, a feeling hard to describe, rising in her chest. Relief, choked anger, and as if she'd finally won the confrontation from last year. When rumors spread that under that weird dome it's more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside, Red Valley residents began trekking up to North Bluff to see for themselves. They said nothing when near Clara, just stood a few dozen steps away, arms folded, observing. One hunter frowned. "Maybe it makes a little sense?" another woman said quietly. "Or maybe this winter's just starting. Not sure yet." An old man who'd survived the 1,886 storm stood a long time, eyes tracing each steel beam as if comparing something in memory. "If it really drops 10-15 degrees, then we've been wrong for years." Such talk spread through town, mixed with doubt and fear of being left behind. Some old miners came to ask Clara about the curve, how she calculated foundations, why wind weakened inside. Clara didn't explain at length, just said, "The dome splits the wind. The cabin doesn't bear force. Simple as that." Keller explained for her in his heavy German accent. "When wind hits the curved face, force disperses. It's an old European mechanism. But here, People believe pitched roofs are strongest. Sometimes they believe wrongly. Listeners fell silent. Belief is very hard to change, but a steel structure standing firm on North Bluff where every cabin had collapsed was hard to argue evidence. Clara continued testing every evening, recording data in her late husband's old notebook. Wind speed, snow thickness, sliding off the roof, brace vibration, temperature difference. Each number was a hammer blow on last year's pain, and each number also affirmed she would never let herself or her son die under that invisible but vicious storm wind again. By late November, with the steel dome complete, cabin framed, wood walls thickly built, and the heat oasis proven, Red Valley began looking at Clara not as a madwoman anymore, but as a big question. If that widow could build a storm fortress herself, why couldn't so many men in the area do it? And more importantly, if the coming winter was as fierce as rumors said, how many cabins in the valley would outlast this strange structure? Clara didn't answer the questions they dared not voice. She just kept tightening bolts, testing the cabin door, remeasuring wind gaps, and smiled very faintly. This steel fortress was nearly finished, and winter, finally, would have to face an opponent it could no longer defeat. On the night of the 16th of December, 1892, just past 9 p.m., the sky above Red Valley darkened as if someone had pressed down a thick black cloud layer. Wind began creeping over the Bitterroot Range, at first only 25-30 miles per hour, but within less than an hour it climbed to 50 miles per hour and then hit 65 miles per hour like a giant beast unleashed from chains. Snow fell not in flakes but in large clumps like handfuls of ash thrown from above. Temperature plunged straight to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind chill minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit meant any creature outdoors could survive only minutes without shelter. Clara sat in the cabin, hands on her knees, listening to wind lash the steel dome face. The sound wasn't cracking wood or rattling roof like she'd heard the night her husband died, but a thick, steady metallic drumming, as if the structure absorbed the storm's full power and pushed it aside. Each gust was split by the curved face into two streams, sliding down to form two white snow rivers rushing along both sides of the dome. Clara called them snow rivers. In just the first 3 hours, outdoor snow depth exceeded 4 feet and kept rising. Meanwhile, the cabin inside the dome held plus 18 degrees Fahrenheit even though she'd extinguished the stove an hour earlier to save wood. The air inside stayed strangely dry and stable. No wind whistling through door cracks, no cold seeping through wood gaps. Lucky, the dog who had trembled in fear of last year's storm, now curled tightly at little Samuel's feet, sleeping soundly as if outside were only a light rain. That night, Clara barely slept, not from fear, but because for the first time in her life she faced nature's destructive power without feeling she was confronting death itself. She placed her hand on the ice-cold steel dome, feeling each slight vibration, and whispered, "Stand firm. Prove them wrong." The storm peaked at dawn on December 17. Wind at 65 miles per hour gusted in bursts, as if trying to lift the whole town. Snow fell in thick white walls. Briggs' chimney was torn down. Wind sucked fire from the stove backward up the roof, igniting a spread to 2 neighboring cabins. One family was trapped in their cabin by snow-buried door, forced to smash a window to escape, but the skin-cutting cold let them run only a few steps before collapsing. 2 elderly people in the eastern valley froze to death before villagers could find them. 7 cabin roofs collapsed in under 12 hours, wood snapping out of walls as if pulled by invisible ropes. By morning December 18, snow reached 12-15 feet in many places, burying the entire road through Red Valley. Those still holding out could only bar doors, keep fires burning, and pray. But North Bluff, once called a cabin graveyard, was the only place not emitting desperate sounds. Clara opened the cabin door and stepped into the space between cabin and dome. Their wind barely touched, only distant tearing sounds as the curved face pushed it aside. The steel dome vibrated lightly but gave no sense of impending collapse. No cracking noises. When she climbed a wooden step and peered through a small gap between sheets, she saw wind sweeping snow off the dome peak like water sliding off rock. Not a single patch could cling to build load. Clara felt she stood in the heart of a steel creature fighting the storm in her place. On the night of December 18, the storm began easing. Temperature still minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, but wind dropped to 35 miles per hour. Snow falling in bursts stopped. When Clara extinguished the oil lamp, she glanced at her sleeping son, Lucky lying close, and told herself, "This steel fortress will answer every mocking smile." She didn't say it to anyone, but the truth was too clear. The whole town had laughed at her. Yet this very steel dome had kept her alive in a storm that could kill anyone in the wrong place. On the morning of December 19, the sky suddenly cleared to an almost unreal blue, the kind of stark, cold clarity after nature had exhausted its fury. Clara stepped out from under the dome, shoes sinking into nearly 4 feet of fresh snow. Before her, Red Valley was no longer a town, but a vast white graveyard. Cabins that once stood defiant now showed only roof peaks poking through snow. Some places only lonely leaning chimneys remained. Farther off, a thin gray smoke rose from a row of cabins in the valley where last night's fire had died but left a heavy, damp ash smell in the air. Clara stood silent. All sound seemed sucked away, only her breathing and the faint crunch of snow underfoot. She knew what had happened. The storm hadn't just attacked the town, it had crushed it. And in that moment, amid a red valley buried in ice and ash, Clara understood last night would be the turning point. Those who once mocked her now perhaps had nothing left to cling to except the warmth of the steel fortress standing firm behind her. The first knock on the steel dome door came on the morning of December 19, so faint Clara thought she misheard. But then a second knock, stronger, more trembling, rang out in the post-storm silence. Clara stepped out of the cabin, opened the inner wooden door, and saw Sheriff Lorne Briggs standing there, the man who'd laughed loudest when she bought North Bluff, who'd told her straight to her face that a woman wouldn't make it through this winter. Now he stood before her, face purple from cold, beard crusted with ice, lips trembling wordlessly. We have nowhere else to go," he said, voice hoarse as if wind had cut half of it away. Clara asked nothing more. "Come in." Briggs nearly collapsed as he crossed the boundary from wind to warmth under the steel dome. He covered his face for seconds as if unable to believe the place truly existed. But the next footsteps made Clara turn immediately. 3 families from the eastern valley were struggling up the snow-altered road. 2 men carrying small children, a mother wrapping a torn blanket around a child no longer able to cry. Behind them, 2 older kids pulling a mangled wooden cart, Lucky running up and down barking loudly as if guiding them. Clara ran to help each one step under the dome. When she took the near-exhausted child from the mother's arms, the small body felt cold as frozen wood. The mother sank down. "Please, please, don't let him die." Clara placed a hand on the woman's back, saying only, "He's safe here now." Before she could catch her breath, Clara heard a familiar call from behind. "Clara." Johann Keller, the stern blacksmith, the only one who'd understood the dome mechanism from the start, limped toward her. His left arm was roughly bandaged with cloth, dried blood visible under snow. "Roof came down right when I tried to brace the door." He breathed heavily. "If I hadn't jumped out in time, I wouldn't have made it." Clara supported him inside, a hard-to-describe emotion flashing in her eyes. Those who'd silently watched her now stood at the steel fortress door like pilgrims, seeking final refuge. Within half an hour, 21 people from all over Red Valley arrived one by one to knock shivering, dejected, some nearly unconscious. None retained the pride or doubt that had clung to them weeks before. When the last one entered, Clara stood straight and said clearly, "This dome is enough for everyone." And she immediately set to work as if she'd prepared for this moment long ago. Clara divided sleeping areas into 3 groups. Children close to the cabin for warmth, elderly beside the wood walls, able-bodied near the dome door for easy snow access to melt water. She asked 2 young men to tend the fire while she took a large pot, scooped the remaining meat and vegetables from stores, and started cooking a big pot of hot soup. When the first steam rose, many burst into tears, not from hunger, but because for the past 48 hours they'd seen no warmth except dying stoves in ruined cabins. Clara gathered dry wood from the 2 huge wood walls, enough to burn for a week if needed. Only 1 stove was lit, but heat under the dome rose so fast she had to open vents to avoid overheating. The cabin thermometer read plus 25 degrees Celsius, a number no one could believe when outside was still minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The children woke to the warmth, cries turning to steadier breaths. The mother held her child so tightly her shoulders shook. Sheriff Briggs sat against the steel wall, hands covering his face. He couldn't look at Clara from shame. Keller gently placed his uninjured hand on Briggs's shoulder, whispering, "At least we still have a chance to apologize." Briggs only nodded heavily. Once everyone had eaten some soup and regained warmth, Clara stood in the middle of the dome, looking at each dazed but living face. She didn't lecture, didn't reproach, didn't recall the mocking laughter from when she began building the dome, but none of the 21 could forget. They sat inside what they'd once called bizarre, insane, a steel donkey shed. And now it was the only reason they still breathed. A 10-year-old boy looked up and asked, "Miss Clara, why is this dome so strong?" Clara just smiled faintly. "Because it was built to stand in the storm, not run from it." No one said more. Silence filled the steel dome space. A silence no longer doubtful, no longer mocking, but full respect. Outside, wind rose again in a light gust, but only to slide off the dome and dissolve into the valley white. Inside, 21 people warmed themselves, ate soup, and understood that tonight they would not die. They were saved by the hands of the woman they'd once scorned. And when Clara extinguished the oil lamp, letting firelight cast shadows on the steel dome, no one dared look up for long because they knew the very thing they'd mocked was now sheltering them from a winter none of them could have survived alone. The next morning, as the sun rose but its light still weak, as if filtered through frosted glass, Red Valley appeared before Clara and the survivors, like a town erased from the map. Snow, 10-14 feet thick, still lay heavy on collapsed cabin roofs, only broken rafters poking up like bare ribs. Many structures were now just blackened heaps from fires that flared when roofs broke and wind spread flames before snow quenched them. Sheriff Briggs stood on the hill beside the steel dome, voice choked. Red Valley isn't what it was anymore. Blacksmith Keller looked down at his bandaged hands, murmuring, "Without Clara's dome, we'd be gone too." The rest stayed silent. No one dared mention how they'd laughed at her. By noon, after the strongest men cleared a narrow path down to town center, they returned with determined but bewildered eyes. Briggs spoke first. "Clara, we need to know how you did this." A woman holding her child added through tears, "Please teach us. We don't want to lose anyone else." Clara stood still for a long moment, long enough everyone thought she would refuse. Then she nodded, lightly but firmly. "I will teach. Anyone who wants to learn, follow me." The steel dome became the town's temporary classroom. Clara took paper, pencil, and wooden board, writing a 6-page guide. Foundations 3 feet deep. Joint angles 72 degrees. Horizontal brace spacing 4 feet. How to bolt so steel doesn't twist under wind load. How to calculate snow slide based on dome curve. She drew each joint, each steel member, each load point, all with the lines of someone unused to teaching but deeply understanding every screw because her own hands had hauled each sheet up the hill. Keller stared at the drawings. "Clara, you understand structure like a miner understands rock." Clara only replied, "The storm taught me." By week's end, 27 people had signed up to learn dome building. By mid-March, steel from the old mine was gathered, hauled by sled, by back, by every means they had. And then something unprecedented in Red Valley history appeared. 4 new steel domes rose like weather fortresses, standing proud amid melting snow. One at the Pattersons, one at Keller's, one for the Caldwell family, and one for the chapel burned in the storm. On the day the first new dome was finished, Briggs placed his hand on the cold steel and sighed. "We should have believed you sooner." Clara looked at the town reviving bit by bit, speaking slowly as if drawing from her heart. "Not believe me. Just believe the old way isn't always right." Little Caldwell girl looked up at Clara, eyes shining. "Miss Clara, your steel dome is like a giant umbrella covering the whole town." The remark made many laugh, not mocking laughter like before, but the laughter of survivors long enough to appreciate the new thing that saved their lives. And as snow began melting, revealing first brown patches of spring ground, Red Valley understood they were entering a new era. An era where a widow once deemed insane had taught them to stand firm against nature with a curved steel dome and the belief that innovation could save lives. News of the widow's steel fort spread faster than any wagon, train, or mail route in the mountains that spring of 1893. Just weeks after the historic storm, people from Crestline, Pine Butte, even towns over 40 miles away, like Silver Junction, began whispering about a widow who built a steel fortress that withstood 65 miles per hour winds and over 12 feet of snow without budging. Stories grew embellished. Some said her steel dome was warm as a church. Others that it never held snow even in a 100-day winter. Then groups began appearing on the road to North Bluff. Gold prospectors passing through, seasonal hunters, traders from markets, farmers who'd lost homes in the storm, all coming to see with their own eyes what they thought was exaggerated rumor. But when they stood under the 52 feet long, nearly 40 feet high steel dome, seeing two huge dry wood walls and the wooden cabin snug within the protection like an embryo in hard mineral, they all sighed the same way. This thing isn't a joke. Some tapped the steel, hearing the solid ring. Some measured the curve. Some stood at wind funnels to feel the air split and divert to both sides, just as she described. Clara, unused to crowds, became an unwilling guide. She pointed to braces, bolts, vent gaps, 3 feet deep foundations. She explained why snow couldn't grip the curved face, why wind force hitting the dome was forced to slide down instead of slamming straight into a traditional pitched cabin roof. Listeners, whether seasoned blacksmiths or farmers who'd never left Red Valley, nodded with slow amazement. A gold miner from the north said, "Never seen anyone use steel this smart in my life." A taciturn trader said, "A widow did something the whole valley's men never thought of." But the one who made everyone go still was Johann Keller. He stood amid the crowd, voice low but clear enough that even wind couldn't drown it. "She understands wind better than we do. This whole region lives by wind and dies by it. But Clara knows how to talk to it." From that day, the label Crazy Widow vanished from Red Valley. People called her by a new name, Wind Reader Widow, the woman who could read wind. Those wanting to learn dome building came in growing numbers. Clara charged only for steel, wood, foundations, no fee for teaching. "Knowledge has to save others," she said. "If it only saves me, it means nothing." When the first 4 steel domes rose in the valley, passers-by asked, "Who taught you?" And Red Valley people answered with unguarded pride, "The widow at North Bluff." Somehow, a woman once scorned, living with a small child and a dog on cursed land, became inspiration spreading from valley to valley. A legacy without proclamation, without fame, just standing firm after a storm when everything else fell. And as the next winter approached, neighboring towns began raising their first curved domes, each smaller and lower, but each carrying a piece of Clara's idea. The northern mountains suddenly became safer thanks to a widow the whole town once laughed at. Many years passed. The steel dome on North Bluff still stood, no repainting needed, no propping up, quietly catching sun, catching wind, holding its shape from the day Clara finished it. By 1910, Red Valley Town Council decided to erect a memorial plaque right at the entrance. Clara Hensley, she sheltered us when winter took everything. On the day the plaque was hung, many old folks in the valley wept, not because they recalled the terror of the great storm, but because they remembered the moment they stepped into a widow's steel fortress they'd mocked and realized their lives and their children's lives were preserved by an idea they lacked the courage to believe in. Every winter, Red Valley children were brought to visit the original dome. They ran around the steel braces, placed hands on metal worn by years but strangely still solid. Adults told them that in the winter of 1892, when minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit winds blew through the mountains, when 7 cabin roofs collapsed, when fire from broken chimneys swept half the town, this very place kept 21 people alive. The children would fall quiet, looking up at the dome's ceiling, nearly 40 feet high, like gazing at a steel sky, feeling what adults had long understood. Persistence is sometimes stronger than any blizzard. Young blacksmiths in the area still studied Clara's sketches, 6 pages of yellowed paper, edges torn, but lines still clear as the first day. They told each other that Red Valley wasn't rebuilt just with wood and steel, but with the courage of a woman who looked at death and answered with a design. When Clara passed away, people placed flowers beneath the memorial. And each year on the historic storm's date, The town lit 21 candles inside the dome, one for each survivor saved by her. At the end of the memorial, the town leader would read the saying passed to future generations, a simple line holding the spirit of America's mountain country, where people learned not to fear nature, but never stopped thinking how to overcome it. It isn't steel that keeps people alive, but the eyes daring to see a solution even when everyone else sees only something to mock. Under candlelight reflecting on the old steel dome, that saying rang like a promise, that innovation always matters, and the courage to believe in it, that is the true legacy of widow Clara Hensley. If you want to continue exploring stories of survival and ingenuity that saved entire communities, please subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the upcoming inspiring journeys.